All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. So first off, I want to thank you for joining today's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about 5 performance boosting vSphere features that you're missing out on. My name is Andy Syrewicze from Altaro Software, and I'm joined today by Ryan Birk. How's it going, Ryan?
It's going good. How are you, Andy?
Good, good. Hey, appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us about vSphere today. We're looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
So hey, the first thing I want to cover today is just kind of our agenda. So the first thing that we're really going to be doing here is we're going to do some introductions of Ryan, myself, and Altaro Software. Then we're going to hand things over to Ryan and let him walk you through the bulk of today's presentation. Going to be covering things like vShield endpoints, high availability, VMware Converter, Update Manager, resource pools, and we'll be doing a Q&A session at the end. So one thing I always like to point out about the Q&A, you've got the questions form there in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to use that as the webinar progresses. And you know, if we have the ability to stop real quick sometime during the presentation and cover a question, we'll try to do that. But usually we end up getting to all the questions at the end of the webinar. What we'll do is if you ask a question that doesn't get answered, we'll definitely cover that in a follow-up blog post after the fact. We always do a follow-up blog post on the Altaro VMware blog. And again, if you asked a question and it didn't get answered during the day today, be sure to take a look at our follow-up blog post. That'll contain a full list of the Q&A, the questions and their associated answers. There'll also be a copy of the slide deck and a full recording of today's video. So you're definitely going to want to take a look at that if you asked a question that did not get answered during the live Q&A today. So let's do some quick introductions. Introduce myself really quick. Again, my name is Andy Syrewicze with Altaro Software. I'm a technical evangelist with Altaro Software. Been here for a couple of years now. I'm a cloud and data center MVP with Microsoft. I'm a VMware vExpert. I've been around the industry for 15 years now, as hard as that is to believe for myself. But yeah, my focus has always been in virtualization, be that VMware or Hyper-V. All this information is great information and should be very helpful for you guys inside of your own environments. So I'll hand it over to Ryan to do his own introduction.
Yeah, sure. So my background, guys, is I've been a VMware instructor now for a few years. I've been a vExpert since 2012. This year actually was nominated as a vExpert on vSAN for the first time, so that's kind of a cool thing. And I've been a consultant, so I've done lots of VMware consulting and over the years, and you see small businesses, medium-sized businesses, larger businesses. So we go through and you end up seeing lots of different stuff, and it's always fun to talk about. I've loved this the industry. I'm also an MCSC on Hyper-V. So I've went through and I've worked with Hyper-V and done VMware stuff over the years, and it's just I'm just like Andy. It's a fun thing. So it's a fun industry to be in, and I always say it's more of a hobby than it is a job. It's just one of those fun things to talk about and to kind of see what's going on. But yeah, VMware for me has been I'm a big advocate of home labs. I've got a blog. I'm always going out there, and I've got different ideas for home labs and stuff like that, and people preparing for the studying for the VCP exams and such. So yeah, my primary job is I'm an instructor, so I'll go through. Some of the stuff we're gonna cover are one of those things where these are questions that I get asked a lot in classes. So hopefully they're beneficial to you guys today.
Hey, appreciate that, Ryan. Thanks. So the last introduction I want to do real quick is Altaro Software. So again, I work for Altaro. We're a fast-growing developer of some pretty awesome backup software. We focus specifically on the SMB and the mid-market space and for MSPs, supporting customers in those spaces. Our virtual backup solution is trusted by 30,000 plus customers and 6,000 plus partners. That flagship product is Altaro VM Backup. If you're interested in a little bit more information on that, we've got the link right there, altaro.com/VM-backup. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Ryan to kind of walk us through the bulk of today's presentation and take it away.
All right, Andy. So we're going to first start our day, morning, afternoon, I guess depending on wherever you're at. We're going to talk about vShield endpoint. So vShield endpoint, some of these features are things that people either they don't know about, they haven't ever used it, or they or that they just kind of just don't know that it exists, and they need to know more information. But endpoint is one of those things where I see it, it's a very cool tool. If you've never touched this, you've never used vShield endpoint, it's just one of those things where it kind of changes the game in terms of what you're doing with antivirus. I mean, to put it simply, vShield is an antivirus tool. It allows you to offload stuff. So what happens, and I think one of the reasons that a lot of people don't necessarily use vShield endpoint is because VMware, when you think about VMware, they're not necessarily an antivirus company. They don't do that. And typically, you're going to have to use a third party or a VMware partner to go through and do antivirus. So there's different components, and what you're doing is you're using introspection at the hypervisor level. So and the nice part here is that you actually, even if you're using vSphere Essentials, you have the ability to run vShield endpoint. So we're talking about barebone, the barebone license. You get the most basic license. You can go out, you get the Essentials Plus license, and you've got vCenter. But they go through, they've got anti-malware. You go out, there's again, if you've got the various features that you need to offload this stuff, endpoint is there. So there's no separate license key needed. Now, they have kind of done a little bit of changes in terms of what vShield endpoint looks like in terms of NSX. So people have always, there's a little bit of confusion around there, to be honest, because it's kind of a marketing thing, but there's a vCloud networking and security. People always say, well, hey, isn't this retired? Do they do this anymore? Is this still available out there? Well, they now have a new tool. It's called NSX for vShield endpoint. And it allows management from the NSX manager. So essentially the tool is still there, but you're going to be using, you use NSX for vShield endpoint. So if you've purchased vSphere with vShield endpoint, Essentials Plus or higher, you have it available, and you can actually go through and do that. But the nice part, I remember the first time that I saw this in action, people always say, well, tell me how this works. How does this tool function? How does it work? So what happens is you work with a partner vendor, and what happens is this introspection happens. So what happens is, let's say in a virtual desktop environment or even in a server environment, something bad happens at the VM level. Well, what happens is that it never happens. It's crazy. I know it's weird to think about that, but it never actually happens. So when somebody does something that they are not supposed to be doing, it essentially is intercepted and it doesn't happen at all. So if somebody tries to open up a file that's infected, it simply quarantines it. It does not allow them at all to do it. And it's just, what's nice is that you don't have to deal with the traditional scans in an environment. That's always a big hiccup. People say, well, why would I move away from my traditional antivirus? Well, the reason being is that on Tuesday mornings or Tuesday afternoons when you do your antivirus scans, what's nice is you don't have a virtual desktop environment. I always like to pick on virtual desktops for vShield endpoint. If you guys end up going and using any kind of virtual desktops, that's always an issue. How do I do scans? How do I do this? And this is a tool that helps you do it. All right. So vShield endpoint's one of my favorite kind of like, hey, I'm not exactly sure what I should do with my antivirus in a virtual desktop environment or a virtual server environment. And this is just one of those things that allows you to do it. So check it out. So in terms of fine tuning high availability, that's going to be the next thing we're going to get into. And this is going to be, we've got a few sections in here like the HA and the resource pools where we're going to spend a little bit more time, talking about it this morning. But in terms of HA, what we're going to do is there's certain ways and certain things that you can really truly screw up in an HA environment. There's no doubt about it. A lot of people think, oh, well, I'll just turn on HA and it's just a checkbox. Well, the first thing I'm here to tell you is that HA is not a checkbox. You might think it is. You might think, oh, it's just super easy. I'll turn it on. I'll check that box. It's a cluster setting. I will also say that it's a part of your business continuity plan, but it's not the end all be all. Okay. HA is not, it's not something that you would want to go out and think, oh, well, I'm covered. I don't need to do backups. I don't need to do anything else. No, that is absolutely not, that's not true. I mean, HA is going to fail VMs over, but it's not going to, if you do something silly in your VM, you need a backup. It's not a backup in a way. It's failover is really what it's doing. So, not every VM is going to need HA. That's an important piece. So that's when you turn on and you check the box for HA, I always tell everybody you need to go through and you need to make sure that you understand that not every VM needs this. Okay, You're going to have test VMs. You're going to have, if you're in an environment where you mix your production stuff and you mix your test stuff into the same exact cluster, you need to make sure that you essentially rank those VMs. Okay, your production stuff needs to come up before you actually go through and you do any kind of test stuff. There's nothing worse in the world where you come in on a Monday morning, you didn't realize you had a failure on the weekend, and then all of a sudden your domain controller doesn't power on, but you have a Windows 10 test VM that you were using to play around with some random application. It booted up, but your server didn't come online. So you need to go in and you need to rank them. Shared storage, you're not going to get away without doing a shared storage with HA. Okay, if your VMs are on local disk, it has to have shared storage. It's incredibly important. A lot of people will see, oh, hey, look, I don't need shared storage to do vMotions, to do live migrations. Well, okay, I'll just stick with that, and I'll save some money. I won't buy a SAN. Well, guess what? If you don't have shared storage, you're not going to be able to go out, and you're not going to be able to use HA. Period. All right, redundant management networks as well. So another thing that a lot of people do is they just have one management network. They run one physical cable to one physical switch, but you need to go out. If you're going to do it properly, you need to make sure you have two physical cables, two physical switches. Preferably set them in two separate power circuits as well. All right, it's one of those things you kind of need to sit back and you need to whiteboard. You've got to spend some time talking about that stuff. So we need to go out. We need to whiteboard this stuff. Take some time when you're designing your HA networks. So the third bullet down, that your ESXi hosts, they should have similar hardware specs. Is it a requirement? No. VMware will tell you that no. You can have an environment where you can go through, you can just throw anything you want in the cluster, and as long as they're running the same EVC, you'll be okay. Now the issue is that you will run into scenarios where we start dealing with slot sizes. Okay, we start dealing with the size of hosts. Okay, well, one host is bigger. Well, think of it this way: if you have 3 hosts in a cluster and one host is not nearly as big as the other 2, and then what happens is one of those large hosts fail, you can get yourself into a scenario. I always say that generally 3 hosts is better than 2, because if you have one host goes down and 2 hosts to cluster, you are you walk a fine line. You might not have enough resources to power on those VMs, so you just have to be you've got to make sure that you have the availability. But it's a cluster setting. All right, one of the hosts it's elected as a master host. The other hosts are going to be slave hosts, so they kind of have to have this election. They're sent over that management network. So again, that's why redundancy is key. You need to go through and you need to make sure that in terms of redundancy, you're there. But you can go out, and people always say, well, can I use my vMotion network as a backup management network? The answer is yes. As long as you go in and you check the box to use it as a management network, that's a simple fix. You can go through, you can use your vMotion network as a backup management network. There's essentially little hello packets that go over the network. It's not a lot of traffic, but you need to have 2. So if you're using vSAN as well, the vSAN network that vSAN creates can also be used as a backup management network. So that's something to keep in mind. So again, using those redundant networks, all cables, make sure you're not using one big flat network. I will say that's one of the worst things that I've seen as a consultant. You go into an environment, everybody's just got everything on 192.168 one dot network, and it's just not good. So VLANs will work, but you want to verify that your management networks are separate. Okay, so VLANs, the issue that you'll run into with VLANs is if you're using a VLAN for your management network and you're using a VLAN for your storage network and you're running them all on the same switches. All right, and you want to generally isolate your storage traffic from your management traffic. All right, and then disable host monitoring. So if you're performing network maintenance, you want to reconfigure HA on the cluster after you're doing network maintenance, and consistent port group names. I see this as well. People will just slap together an ESXi host. They'll call a port group prod on one ESXi host, and they'll call another production on the other ESXi host. So prod and production, they're not the same. So even though you know that they're the same as a human, you're like, well, they're the same network. VMware is going to say that name does not equal this name. I'm not going to fail over. Okay. So it's as smart as you think it is. It's one of those things where it'll get you every time. Verify your MTU sizes are the same across all hosts. So you don't want one host to have jumbo frames, the other host not have stuff on. All security policies must be the same across port groups. So let's for instance, I'll pick on promiscuous mode. So if you've got promiscuous mode turned on one host, you want to make sure that it's on the other port group, on the other ESXi host, because I've seen strange random weirdness where hey, this was working yesterday, but it's not working today. Well, why not? Well, oh, it looks like we had an HA problem, and we need to go through and we need to, it doesn't have that on the other destination host. So, make sure at the very bottom there, I like to make sure all network adapters are the same configuration during the host deployment. So, what do I do? One of the easy ways to do it is just to use Power CLI. So I'm a big fan of just picking up, Power CLI. Do you have to be a Power CLI guru to do this? No. There's a lot of scripts that are made available online that you can use, but the two that are going to help you out in this case are new virtual switch and new virtual port group. So, if all this stuff is, you just want to keep your host boring. You really do. All of your stuff needs to be boring. Every host should be configured the same. All the networks should be the same. And Power CLI, it makes it so you don't have any typos. And that's the key thing here. So some storage recommendations. You want to, again, like I said, keep your environment boring. That's a big thing to do. So all hosts should see the same data stores. There shouldn't be any kind of variance between the hosts. So you don't want one host to see 10 data stores and the other host to only see 3, okay? Because it's going to cause failover problems. So if you've got VMs that are powered on and you're thinking, oh, it's going to fail over to my destination host, that's important. And then you have to have heartbeat data stores as well. So those heartbeat data stores, they need to be isolated from your management network and they need to be resilient to failure, okay? And what I like to do, and this is just me, I like to, if I have the ability to run an NFS data store, I'll use NFS on one, and then I'll use VMFS for my other shared data stores. So there's nothing saying that you have to use all VMFS data stores, or I'll go through and I like to mix it up, create a little bit of a hybrid environment if you're going to do it. So in terms of admission control, this is something that I was talking about earlier with slot sizes. All right. So with admission control, it guarantees that you have capacity for failover. All right. So it's constantly monitoring the host resources. It's going in and saying, okay, we need to go through. We need to make sure that we have the host resources that are available. So you've got to be aware when putting hosts in maintenance mode or removing hosts from a cluster. So for patching, for instance, so if you're going to patch an environment, you put a host in maintenance mode. It's not going to allow you to patch VMs. You're not going to have the ability to go through and do that. All right. So with maintenance mode, you're taking the resources away from the HA failover. So like for patching, you got to make sure that you have have enough. Like I like to patch in the middle of the day, okay? And with HA, from an HA perspective, you just have to be aware, like, okay, well, if I have a failover or I have a failover issue, an event, these VMs need to be able to get up. They need to be able to be brought up somewhere. So you can't run out of slot sizes. So with admission control, it's going to go through. You have different constraints on the resource usage. So, actions might be disallowed. So like it's not gonna, if you run out of resources, it's not gonna allow you to power on a VM. It might not allow you to migrate VMs, okay? Increasing the CPU or memory reservation of a VM. We're gonna talk about reservations here in just a few minutes. All right, we're almost to the resource pool stuff here. But I'm not gonna talk too much about reservations now, but a reservation is a minimum promise. So if you're telling a VM, hey, you're guaranteed to have this amount of resources, well, HA, if it might not power it on if that host can't guarantee it, okay? So the basis, in terms of HA admission control, you've got to go out, you've got to look at your cluster resource, you look at your slot policy, and then you can have dedicated failover hosts. Now, I've had some of, like I said, I'm an instructor, so I have students who come through my classes sometimes and they say, well, okay, dedicated failover hosts. Yeah, you got to have a lot of money to do that. And the truth is yes, you do. But if you want to make sure that everything is going to work exactly like it was, a dedicated failover host is a great option. So what that's doing is you basically have an ESXi host that's just sitting there, powered on, doing nothing until one host goes down. And then what happens is everything. And if you're going off of what I was talking about earlier, that all of your hosts have the same amount of CPU, the same amount of memory, it's basically going to be just like a random reboot of the VM. That's what it's going to look like because it's going to perform, adequately over on their destination host. So, it'll go through. You can also, like the cluster resource percentage, you can say I want to reserve a certain amount of CPU and a certain amount of memory for these VMs. And then you can do slots, and slot sizes are essentially the minimum amount of resources that the VMs are going to get, or to power on. So it's going to go through. But slot sizes, setting things manually become troublesome. I don't like to ever set the slot sizes manually. I try to avoid it these days. I'll go out and I'll use the cluster resource percentage. The issue with setting slot sizes is that in a server environment, particularly, your servers, I've never met anybody, I've never been in any environment where everyone has the same exact specs for servers. that's kind of our goal, right? That's what we start with. But then the users, they say, well, I need more memory, and that's, if I had $1 for every time that somebody said, hey, I need more memory, it's never the same. Okay, it's never the same. You're gonna get different resources for everything. So, when you're going through and you're setting, manual slot sizes are okay in things like virtual desktop environments where every VM has like X amount of memory and X amount of CPU. Okay, there's very little difference or change. But in a server environment, those manual slot sizes can become troublesome. So you have to keep that in mind. But those are some of the HA tweaks that typically I've ran into, or that I would generally say you've got to stay on top of when you're setting this stuff up. But I think a lot of people from an HA perspective, they just think, oh, I'm going to go in, I'm going to check that box, and everything's good to go. And it can't be any more far from the truth. I mean, there are things that you have to set, and the most important thing being, you need to go in and you need to set which ones are important to you. You've got to set essentially, these are my production machines. If you're doing a hybrid cluster, now people say, well, should you create a hybrid cluster? So should I mix my production stuff in with my test stuff? And the answer is, if you're doing it properly, yes, absolutely. That's the thing. And what we're going to talk about here in a few slides is resource pools. So we'll get to resource pools in a little bit, but you can use resource pools to do that. All right. Again, that's something else that you got to make sure that you're on top of. So in terms of VMware Converter, this is another tool. We're going to switch gears here for a minute, and we're going to talk about another tool that maybe you have used it, maybe you have not used it. This tool has been around for a long time. It's been around for a long time. VMware Converter is a tool that VMware has put out years ago because they were wanting people to actually go through and looks like I'm having an issue here. Do you guys see my slides? It says PowerPoint has crashed, trying to recover.
Yeah, I can see it. I can see it restarting, Ryan.
All right, hang on just a second. I'm going to stop my screen share and we're going to share it back out one more time.
The gremlins had to show up for a second there, didn't they?
I know, right? What in the world is going on? Now I can't.
If you want, I can share my slide deck on this side. That's fine too.
That's fine if you want to. Mine. I can try to relaunch it here.
Okay, give you one more second there, and
let's do that. I'm going to relaunch it. We'll see if that happens. See if that helps.
Okay. If all else fails, we'll do it from my end.
Let me find the slide we were on.
This is live television, folks. Anything can happen.
Yeah. All right. I think we are back in action here. So let me switch it.
Yep.
All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep. Looking good now.
All right. Hey, there we go. So I was mentioning VMware Converter, which is a really cool tool. I mean, it's been around for a very long time, and what happens in terms of physicals? You're taking a physical server and you are converting it over to a VM. It's a simple tool with really what it's doing. So you can go through, you can convert VMs from other hypervisor platforms to VMware, and it allows you just to go through and take a VM and just dump it to a VM. I mean, or take a physical box and dump it to a VM. So you can run it remotely. It greatly reduces the firewall issues if you run it on the machine, though. And then you can resize your disks at the destination. That, to me, is one of the big benefits. So, in the physical world, what happens is somebody, they say, oh my gosh, from a physical environment, I need tons of memory, I need tons of CPU, and they just don't need it. Okay, they don't actually need it. So what happens there is you can always resize it. So in the physical world, you had a terabyte disk, and it turns out you're only using 200 gigs worth of actual space. So what you can do is you can reclaim some of the disk space. So converters are a neat tool. You go out, you can point it, and you can say, I want to take this disk and I want to shrink it down. A couple of things I will say that are a little tricky with VMware Converter. So if you've never done it or never used VMware Converter, you have to remember that your data is going to stay the same, but you're going to have different hardware. All right, you're going to have different hardware. So you can do, and the biggest thing is network adapters. Okay, don't forget that. So what I do, anytime that I do a P2V, and that's physical to virtual. That's just the kind of the lingo for that if you've not heard of that. But you do an IP config/all, and then pipe it to an IP, I just IP config.txt. And the reason I do that is because you're essentially going to fall offline if you're getting new network adapters and you're using like static IPs. So you're gonna have to go in when you do a P2V and essentially make sure that those IPs are proper. Okay. And then the other thing too that will get you is that you want to make sure that if you don't have local administrator credentials. So I know some people who, big environments, large companies that, okay, well, we'll give you, domain credentials. So I will go in and I will cache my credentials. All right, I'll actually go through and I'll cache it so that way I can, I can at least log into the machine. Because remember, you're not gonna have networking. That's gonna go offline. You don't want to dig around for the data. You can get these things done relatively quickly. And then the other thing too that I've seen that is what is a pet peeve of mine is that when you do a P2V, always remove all the vendor related stuff. So if you've got HP or you have Dell stuff, generally, or IBM or whatnot, they always have that software. They got like a million different applications that you have to install when it's on a physical box. Well, you don't need that anymore. So I haven't checked for a while, but it's a point there. You could always go online. Somebody would have like a script that you could run that would just remove like a ton of apps, for P2Vs. But if you go through, you open up the control panel, you remove the programs, you're in good shape. It's a good way to go through and do that. So the other tool we're going to talk about is Update Manager. All right. So Update Manager, this is a pretty cool tool. And again, VMware's made this easier for you guys to use. In the old vSphere 6, so if you're using 6.0, all right, Update Manager was not built in to the product. It wasn't built into the Linux appliance. Okay. So it's kind of there's some people who say, well, I didn't know that I could use this. So, and yeah, is this free? So if you have Essentials Plus or higher, this comes with vCenter. All right, it comes with it. So you should use it if you can use that. Do you have to use it? The answer is no. You can absolutely go through it. Down at the very bottom, I'll give you some options on very simple ways to patch your ESXi host. So what happens when it comes down to patching? Is there a certain process that you need to go out and you need to do? Typically, Update Manager, you got to remember that in 6.5, it's now bundled as part of the appliance. All right. Now, the Linux appliance, if you go back and if we go back to a month ago, VMware announced that they were killing off the next named version of vSphere. They were no longer going to support the Windows version of vCenter. Okay. So that's kind of what I'm focused on today is really the Linux appliance. So that's what we want to focus on is the Linux appliance. So in 6.5, they have this built in. So it's a lot more usable. But you don't have to have a separate Windows installation required as long as you're using it on 6.5. So I have to be clear there. If you're using it on 6.0, you have to install it on a Windows box and then link it to vCenter. All right, so keep that in mind. And then your upgrade paths, typically you're going to go through, you're going to start with vCenter. You're going to do your ESXi host, then your VMs, and then don't forget any vendor software. So if you're upgrading ESXi, you might have the Dell version of ESXi. You might have the HP version of ESXi. So you got to make sure that you're installing that with the proper SIM providers. Which leads to the question, do you use the vanilla version or do you provide the version that's provided by your hardware vendor? Generally, you want to use the version that's by your hardware vendor. And the reason being is that all this stuff is built into it. It's meant for the hardware. It has all the software built into it. Now, there's nothing stopping you from installing the plain old vanilla ESXi version that you download from VMware and then all of your vendor stuff. But generally, the easiest path to get it all done is just download it from your hardware vendor. Now, which occasionally what happens is you'll have to wait on your hardware vendor to release the patches and release updates, and so it takes there's a little bit of a delay there sometimes. So that's one of the things that some people will say, well, I use the vanilla version in my test lab, but then I use the hardware version in a production environment. So it's up to you there, but I like to use the hardware vendor version. Patch at the cluster level. So one of the things with Update Manager and patching, what happens is you've got to go through in terms of you want to make sure everybody's running the same patch. Like I said earlier, keep your environments boring. If one host has it, the other host should have it. If you have 8 hosts in the cluster, they all need to be patched the exact same way. So, patch at that cluster level. Everything underneath it then, is at the same baseline. Everybody has it. So what happens if you're patching at the cluster level, it just goes and it does one host, and then it'll go to the next host, and then it's going to go to the next host, and so on and so forth. And then you can disable HA, some of the other cluster features. So typically you want to turn that stuff off because the HA agents are going to be patched. So there's a possibility that they could be patched. And then do you have to use Update Manager? The answer is no. If you're just looking for an easy way to update your ESXi hosts, you can just use ESXCLI. So what you do is you SSH into a host, and then you run the commands ESXCLI network firewall rule set. You can see I've given the what this does, that command that I'm providing there, it goes out, it opens up the firewall, and it says to download 6.5 update 1, and that will update your ESXi host to 6.5 update 1. So it's pretty simple. So if you only have 2 or 3 hosts and you don't want to use Update Manager, you don't have to. vCenter has the ability to go in now on the Linux appliance. So you can just say update. So it's very simple to update that. But if you have a huge environment, it's nice to be able to automate it with Update Manager. Or if your environment starts to grow, Update Manager makes more sense. All right, so using resource pools properly. This is one of those things in terms of, I mentioned it, it kind of goes hand in hand a little bit with HA and in terms of how you're going to set up a cluster. Do you have to have a cluster for resource pools? And the answer is no. You can have resource pools on an individual host, but you can use things like reservations, shares, limits, and only if they're needed in your environment. I try to shy away from going crazy on resource pools just because I think of them as temporary band-aids. They're not really permanent fixes. If you're running out of resources, a resource pool is only going to be able to help you so much. You're not going to be able to just. I think people see these massive hosts and they say, oh, tons of memory, tons of CPU. I'm going to just throw everything on there and I'll just never run out of resources. It happens all the time. The less resource pools, the better. It's easier to troubleshoot. So if you have, 5 different layers of resource pools, it becomes an issue because you can see there, are they expandable reservations? It'll just keep going up. It'll just keep eating resources if you have them set wrong. So, sometimes the answer, with VMs, I always try to start small, but the answer is you might need more resources. So you can delegate resource management, you can group VMs together. That's the big benefit of them is, I mentioned earlier, can you mix your prod stuff with your test stuff? And the answer is yes. So prod, if you have a prod resource pool, you can go through and you can have, your test stuff. So you have a limit. So what is a limit? So we talked about reservations. Now what is a limit? So a limit, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a hard cap. You're not going to be able to use any more than that. So on a memory, the limit defines what the maximum amount of physical memory is. So the limit, you can get, this thing can be very interesting. So you can actually give a VM like 8 gigabytes of memory. So the OS sees 8 gigabytes of memory, but you can limit it to like 4 gigabytes of memory. All right. I always have people joke around and say, well, I do that to my users sometimes. That's I really wouldn't recommend that, but whenever I have that guy who comes and says, I need 8 gigs of memory, and you're like, I know you don't use 8 gigabytes of memory, should I just limit you at 4? You can play silly games like that, but it's very, very dangerous setting. On CPU limit, what happens is, it's how much access you're going to get on the physical CPU. So it goes out. I mean, there's certain pitfalls to these things. The limit is exactly what it does. If you set a limit that's lower than the configured memory for the VM, it's going to cause swapping. You're going to get balloon activity. For the virtual machine. So you'll see swapping and ballooning. All of those are bad. A VM cannot power on unless a reservation can be guaranteed. So a reservation has to be guaranteed. So if you say, I want this VM to have X amount of gigahertz, if that can't be promised, then it doesn't power on. Okay. So, limits on memory, they can have huge consequences. So if I'm troubleshooting stuff, I will go out and I'll look to see if I have individual, VMs that have limits. Now, in terms of CPU, if you enforce a limit, you are limiting the performance of the VM. All right, you might have capacity, but you're limiting the performance. Now that might be your goal in the test environment. That's a possibility. You might actually want to do that in a test environment, but you just have to be careful. So reservations, if we talk a little bit more about reservations, not every single VM is going to need it. Now a reservation is a minimum guarantee. You're going through, you're saying I want to guarantee this amount of resources. So a limit is the opposite of a reservation. So a VM, again, I mentioned it cannot power on, and a reservation is a minimum promise, okay? It's an absolute minimum. So some pitfalls with reservations. So a user has a performance problem. So, it has 8 gigs of memory. You go out, you decide, hey, I'm going to set 8 gigs of memory on this. Does it depend? Is it a good idea to set reservations? The issue with reservations is that no other VM gets those resources. All right, no other VM gets it. So if you power that VM on and you say, hey, I have 8 gigs of memory, I'm going to give it to them and I'm going to set up a reservation of 8 gigs, it's not necessarily the smartest idea. All right, you got to be very careful with that because the other VMs won't get it, period. So you're essentially wasting them. And then, how do you make sure that production VMs perform better than test VMs? I mean, honestly, the resource pools are a good use of that. So if you have a mixed environment, you can use these things called share values, okay? So share values, what they're doing is they're basically making sure that your VMs are running one group of VMs is running better than the other group of VMs. So with shares, again, I keep it simple. There's a recurring theme here with me, is I like to keep life simple. You can complicate things if you want to, but keep it simple. So I will go through, I'll use shares at the resource pool level and create prod or test pools. So shares, they're just a game of fractions. That's all it is. You guys didn't know that you were going to get math here today, but it is fractions. That's all it is. So you can set memory reservations. You can set memory limits. Now we can set share values. Okay. Now it's not a megahertz. It's not a gigahertz. It's not a megabyte or a gigabyte. That's the first thing you got to remember with share values, is when you're setting share values, it's just a number. Okay. So if I set the prod resource pool to 3,000 and I set the test resource pools to 1,000, well, what it does is it adds all that up and it says, okay, prod is going to get 75% of the resources, test is going to get 25% of the resources. All right. So it's going to go through and it's just going to, when the host gets busy, that will happen. So if the host gets busy, you're looking at, you're going to make sure that one set of VMs is going to run better than others. And, it's basically making the production stuff more important. So share values are pretty beneficial and pretty helpful there. All right. So do we have any, I know I'm going to hand it back over here to Andy, but in terms of the VM backup, I think he was going to do some stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks for that, Ryan. Appreciate it. So let me turn my webcam back on here so everybody can see my smiling face. And I'm going to go ahead and take over on presenting here. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to give Ryan a few minutes to kind of take a look at the questions that have been asked thus far, and give viewers a second to go through and maybe ask any questions that they have not yet. So first thing, Ryan, are you able to see my screen okay?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to make sure. So real quick, before we get to the Q&A, I wanted to talk a little bit about our flagship product, Altaro VM Backup. We recently came out with version 7.5. And at Altaro, we really focus on a number of key things. So the first one being efficiency and ease of use. That's really a key focus in everything that we do with our application. And in our demo that I'm going to show you here in just a second, you're gonna see that firsthand. But with ease of use, a lot of times people kind of associate that with, well, maybe the features aren't as good or there aren't as many features. Well, with our focus on ease of use, we also focus on full control of your backups. We do all the stuff that you're used to seeing in a backup application: deduplication, encryption, full end-to-end encryption, instant boot, granular file level restores, full VM restores. I mean, we do just about all of it. So, and then the other thing that we really pride ourselves on is our praise-winning support. So we don't do tiered support here at Altaro. If you call our support team, you're not going to get the whole "have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again" type of thing. Please wait while we escalate you to tier 2. You're not going to get any of that. You're going to get a product expert that owns your issue from start to finish and takes care of you quickly. And then finally, we've got some of the best storage savings in the industry. Back when we released version 7.0, we introduced a new augmented inline deduplication engine into the application, and we've seen some of the best deduplication and compression savings in the industry. So we've been very happy about that. Recently new in version 7.5 as well, as we now have the ability to offsite backups directly to an Azure storage account. We had the ability to do this before, but you needed to be running a virtual machine inside of Azure, running our offsite server software. So not only were you incurring cost for storage, you were also incurring cost for that compute instance inside of Azure as well. Well, now we've completely removed the need for the compute instance. You can go directly to an Azure Blob storage account, and it makes things much more efficient from a cost perspective, from a storage perspective, and generally just makes your life easier, because now you're not supporting an operating system and our offsite server software and an extra compute instance. You're not having to do that anymore. So we've been very happy with that. So real quick, I wanted to just kind of show you the application. I'm going to end the show there and open up our application. So as you're going to see here in a second, like I said, we have a big focus on ease of use. It's very easy to kind of make your way through our application, figure out what you want to do. Where do you go to do a specific thing? It's all laid out quite simply. So you see here, we've got a number of different things on the left-hand side of the screen, and we've got all kinds of different dashboard information here. So you can see, how much free space is available, what are the active and upcoming jobs, recent operations, what are the deduplication compression statistics look like. I mean, a dashboard is a dashboard, right? It's all laid out pretty standard here for you. But when we talk about backup applications, the important thing is you want to actually be able to do a restore, right? Taking a backups is one thing, but the important bit is actually recovering it. So what I wanted to do real quick is just kind of show you how easy it is to walk through a full virtual machine restore. So what you can do here is you can actually click on restore, and you basically first have to determine, where do I want to pull this from? Do I want to pull it from local storage? Do I want to pull it from my off-premise storage here? So you can see here, I actually have the ability to pull it from my Azure storage account. And we like to notify you here that, hey, if you're pulling it from Azure, you're going to incur a little bit of egress bandwidth charges on your Azure account. So just kind of a notification, just kind of an FYI type of thing. But we like to make sure you're aware of that before you go through with this. So for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to select my local storage, and now I have to say, okay, which machine do I want to recover? So I'm going to select this particular virtual machine, hit next, and now just like any other backup application, I have to actually choose, okay, hey, which version of the backup do I want to recover from? So let's say I want to go back to the 14th. By default, we will name the newly recovered VM the same name as the production name, and then we'll append clone and a date and timestamp on the end. You can change this to whatever you want, but I'm going to leave the defaults for this. You have to choose which host you want to recover it to, which data store do you want to send it to, and whether or not you want the virtual NIC to be in a disabled state when it comes online. Particularly important for test restores. Obviously you don't want two IPs talking on the network at the same time. So from there, you just say restore, and you can go to the dashboard to actually monitor the job's progress. So you can actually see that the job has started here, or I can click this drop down up here to see the active jobs running as well. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to sit here and make you watch this whole restore operation occur, and we'll jump back to the slide deck here, and we'll continue on. So hopefully everybody's had time to go ahead and ask their questions. If you haven't yet, be sure to use the Q&A form in GoToMeeting to go ahead and ask your questions. I'm going to go ahead and go through the list here and see what kind of questions we've got waiting for us. Let's see. All right. Still with me, Ryan? You ready to answer some questions?
I am. Absolutely. I'm looking at them. I'm seeing there's a few of them out there. We can cover. So in terms of questions, it looks like we've got one: better to scale out or up for VMware HA? That is an excellent question, and it's not a, in terms of overall, it's kind of a personal preference more so than anything. What I would say, you're probably better off. So people always say, do I go with large hosts or do I go with the small hosts? And it kind of relates back to the HA stuff we talked about. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket with having everything on one ESXi host. So the safe answer for me here is to go out and to use a medium-sized host. So whatever that is, find something right in the middle. The unfortunate thing is, you can go with these massive ESXi hosts if you want to. You'll end up saving a little bit of money on the licensing costs, and it's going to cost you a little bit more if you actually buy less hosts. So from a VMware licensing standpoint, I would highly recommend that typically you go somewhere in the middle. It's always better to buy the larger hosts, and that's the thing. But you have to just kind of weigh the, there's no real magic number, but the medium-sized host somewhere in the middle. I like to, I said 2 hosts is minimum for a cluster, and you can have, I mean, you can have a significant, I mean, you can have 8, 10, there's no real, there is a cap. I don't know I can't remember the exact amount of the exact amount of hosts you can have in 6.5 off the top of my head, but there is a cap. I don't think if anybody's ever going to hit that number, but yeah, somewhere in the middle, just because it's easier to manage. Like, think about it from a patching perspective, like with the Update Manager. So if you patch it and you do the automated cluster patching with Update Manager, you want to go out and you want to make sure that it's not taking forever to put a host in maintenance mode and evacuate all the VMs. So that's kind of my thought process on that. So, see, another question.
Definitely.
I don't know, Andy, do you have any thoughts on that too?
Yeah, I definitely agree with exactly what you said. I mean, really, it comes down to a preference type of thing. I can speak from the experience of having managed a fairly large vSphere cluster where, like 60% of the hosts in the cluster were on the smaller end of the scale, and then like the other 40% were like these massive, huge servers. And the problem that I constantly found myself in, this cluster was growing pretty fast, so we're having to add new servers to it on a regular basis. But having to be able to plan for one of those large hosts to fail was really a headache, because most clusters that you manage, you just assume, okay, I'm n+1, I'm good to go. But now when you have hosts of different sizes, it's not just a matter of being n+1 anymore. It's a matter of, can I tolerate a failure of my largest host in the cluster? And I think a lot of administrators forget about that sometimes. And it's just something that you need to keep an eye on if you're in that situation. My recommendation would be, and then like you said, kind of go middle of the road. But if I was going to go out and I was going to build a large vSphere cluster today from the ground up, I would have the exact same host with the exact same sizes of memory, CPU. That way I don't have to worry about that. I think you mentioned that in your slides earlier in the webinar.
Yeah, keep them boring. It just makes it so much easier to troubleshoot. I'm so crazy. I get laughed at a lot because I'm so crazy. When I build an ESXi host, I will make sure that my hosts have the exact same. Like if HP or Dell sent me a server and I ordered an extra network adapter, I will move it over so they're in the exact same PCI slots. So that way, every single time that I install ESXi, there's no question which one is VMNIC 1, which one is 2, which one is 3. I know it's just gonna install it. So I'm crazy with that kind of stuff. I mean, you just got to make sure you have a standard and stick with the standard if you can, because the failover stuff that's no joke. I mean, if you have one big host fail and you've got a bunch of small ones, who knows if they will really be able to take it.
Yep. Exactly. I think we got another question here about data stores. You were talking about the Heartbeat data store. One common question I get with that is, what kind of data store should be used, and whether or not should it be a dedicated data store. So when I look at that question, it really makes me think of failover clustering in Hyper-V and setting up a quorum disk for a failover cluster. Now, what are your thoughts on that on the vSphere side? I mean, it's kind of the same thing, but kind of not. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so it's not really a quorum, and like if you think about it, so I know some of you guys have come in from Hyper-V. It's not really what you would traditionally think of with a quorum. It's not dedicated in any way, shape, or form. So what you have, you'll notice when you start dealing with clustering with VMware is that you'll have essentially Heartbeat data stores that are going to be used, and there's essentially a powered on list file. So the way HA works is like a high level overview. When you power on VMs, it writes the powered on list. It writes the text file out to essentially the data stores. So that way, when there's a host failure, it'll say, hey, look, these VMs were powered on over here on this ESXi host. We need to go through and do it. So these Heartbeat data stores, they're used as the backup. I mean, in terms of should you use NFS or VMFS, either one works. All right, as long as they're shared data stores and as long as every single one of them has the ability to see the host, you're good to go. I mentioned earlier, I like to make sure that my ESXi hosts see, if I have NFS and I have VMFS, it kind of covers me in both. So if I have a problem with my VMFS storage, my NFS data stores are still fine. I've seen some people, they'll go out in their environment and they'll literally spin up an NFS data store that's only used for heartbeats, but really that's overkill. You don't have to have a dedicated data store for this. So it can be shared. You can have VMs on it, and you're not really having a quorum disk exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a good differentiation to point out, because I talked to a lot of guys that have come over to VMware from Hyper-V, and vice versa. And yeah, that Heartbeat data store is always associated with the quorum disk, just because I mean the clustering both platforms is inherently different, and there's usually some confusion about that. So that's good that we've clarified that. Appreciate it. Next question I see here is kind of about that ESX CLI firewall command that you talked about. So it was in the section where you were talking about update manager, and at the end you mentioned, if you just want to update the host directly, you can issue these couple of commands. First, you open up the firewall, you execute a command after that. Now the question is, are you gonna have to close that firewall when you're done?
Yeah, you're supposed to.
Yeah.
I suppose it depends. I guess it depends on your environment. So what you do, so you have there's a true. So if you go back to the slide, there is if you look at the command, to turn it on, you basically just say true. So there's a little in there, so you get that. And then to turn it off, I know Andy's pulling up the slides here, but to turn it off, what you do is it's simple. You just actually say false. There it is. That was on that last slide.
Yep.
So ESX CLI network firewall rule set -e true. So that opens it. And then when you're done, then you would just turn it off and say false. So I probably should have put that in there. Good eye. So yeah, false. So just switch that over to false. In a lab environment, sometimes I'll leave it on, because in my lab I feel like I'm always updating that. I run out there and I'm always patching and doing stuff. That's a very easy way to patch stuff. A lot of people don't realize it, but you have to. So how that lingo works on that command is that you're not always going to run that exact command. So you're going to have to go out and you'll have to figure out which profile you want to use. So in that case, I'm saying ESXi 6.5.0. And then it gives you a random date, but a random number. So typically what I'll do is you can go out to VMware site and you can get the profile that you're wanting to use, and you spit the profile in there, and then it updates it. So it'll go through. I kind of say it's kind of like apt-get, like you would go, like you think on a Linux box. So you go through and it'll tell you and say, hey, look, when you hit that command, it'll download it, and it's going to say there are 6 packages that are going to be removed, 0 or 2 packages that are going to be added, and 1 package that'll be updated. You click OK, and you're done. So some people will say, well, do I update manager? Is it over the top? Do I need to maintain? I mean, it depends on the size of the environment. But I will say that if you're starting to grow your environment, the part of update manager that is cool is the automation. If you run that command, you're doing things manually. Like you're having to put everything into maintenance mode. You have to evacuate all of your VMs off. And it's not as cool. But update manager, if you do it at the cluster level, it'll go through, it'll do that all for you. All right. So I patch. I know it's crazy, but I patch in the middle of the day, and even in production environments. So if I say, some people will say, well, wow, do you really want to patch in the middle of the day? Yeah, absolutely. But those commands make it easy for you to run that. So update manager, no update manager, either way, you've got the ability to update stuff. But
yeah, that's the beauty of a N+1 cluster, right? Patching in the middle of the day. The days of the 2 a.m. patch cycle are ending, thankfully. I think we got time for another question or two here. Another one that we got here is on the best practice, kind of a best practices question. So, are there any best practices or advice that you can give about the nesting of resource groups?
Yes, don't. The best practices, don't go crazy with that. I'll tell you that. The issue with nesting resource groups and resource pools is you get yourself in a scenario where you need to power a VM on. All right, and you try to power it on, and it won't power on, and then you're, oh my gosh, what am I going to do from that on? How am I going to do this? How am I going to fix it? So what ends up happening in that scenario is everybody goes out and they say, okay, well, I need to power this thing on. So what I'm going to do, here's what they do. They just disable the resource pools. They do all the work that they've done. They say, well, I need to get this machine powered on. So they just go through and they make it expandable. All right. So the problem with expandable reservations is you can make them go up a level. So you can say, if this resource pool runs out, then make it expandable and go up to the next resource pool. And if that one runs out, then go up and go to the next resource pool. So nesting them becomes troublesome when you try to go power on machines and the resources aren't available. So the other issue too is that maybe that VM has a reservation on it. So maybe that a reservation is that minimum guarantee that we talked about. So with reservations, I see people, well, oh, it won't power on. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify my reservation. So I was promising this VM 500 megahertz of CPU. I'll just take that away. All right, and because it's in a nested resource pool, it won't power. So then what ends up happening is you end up with just a messed up environment because you've went through and you've removed stuff that you were supposed to have on there. Like there's a reason that it's on there. So don't take it away. I don't try to go much more than about 2 or 3 layers deep on resource pools at any given time. So I've seen environments, you go in as a consultant where you have like 5 or 6 or 7 layers deep of resource pools, and it's like, why? What are we doing all this for? You can get yourself into some big troublesome issues where you got to monitor that stuff. You got to go through and you got to look at the resources. So 2 or 3 layers. Keep it easy. Make sure that you're looking at reservations. If you've got limits in place, limits are less of an issue because generally you're limiting it to less than what you give it. But the reservation is where you really become issues with you have 7 layers deep and you're trying to power on machines, and then you end up modifying those reservations. So try to avoid them if you can. And going back to another resource pool question, this made me think of one here, but you really got to go out and you've got to make sure that all of your stuff is, look at your resource pools. Do you have to run one resource pool for production, one resource pool for test, or should I run one cluster for resource pool or one cluster for test? And your resource pools are sufficient. If you have one cluster and maintain one cluster, as long as you've got production and test in there, keep it simple.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best advice that I would give on my end too, is just keep it simple. You mentioned going into some of these environments as a consultant and, your resource pools are 7 layers deep. I mean, really, it may seem like a good idea at the time, but, really you're making the future troubleshooting process much more difficult because now it's not just a matter of determining, okay, does this VM have enough resources to power on? It's now you're kind of untangling that web of that whole hierarchy of resource pools, right? So
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
never a fun situation to be in. So excuse me. Well, I think that does it for us today. We're about out of time. I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. I want to say thanks to everyone for attending today. I want to say thanks to you, Ryan, for coming and sharing your knowledge with us today. So thank you for that.
Yeah, sure.
And again, to everyone that's used the questions form, if you ask a question that didn't get answered, we always do a follow-up post on our VMware blog, altaro.com/VMware. And that post will contain a copy of today's webinar, a full list of the Q&A, and you can grab a copy of the slide deck that was used today as well. So with that, I'm going to let everybody go. And again, thank you for attending, and we hope to see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.